I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. We don't often step into national politics, comfortable in what I like to call our worm's eye view of the world. But every now and then, we do look up and out at the sun. This is one of those weeks. Last week, we saw an extraordinary decision by Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and 9 other Democratic U.S. senators to vote for the Republican continuing resolution without being able to secure any clear benefits, except possibly the reversal of the $1 billion cuts in the D.C. budget. Before then, Democratic senators helped confirm their former colleague, Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State with a vote of 99-0. Rubio, a couple of weeks later, decided to kill USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, the first federal agency to be decimated. Democratic rank-and-file members have exploded with anger. But there are differences with moderates who believe that pushing back federal closure was in and of itself sufficient rationale for the Schumer 10 to support the continuing resolution. I decided to call Michelle Nguyen, a Democratic campaign consultant who, in the last election cycle, worked for David Trone's primary campaign as political director, and then served as a regional rep from the DNC to the Kamala Harris campaign. I called Nguyen as she is preparing to leave the DC region to move to New York, where she will be vice president of Red Horse Strategies, a political consulting firm. For what it means to be a 50% Democrat, stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by Improbable Comedy and the Sprung Comedy Festival. Check out our 8 different shows, as well as classes in stand-up comedy and storytelling. March 26th through 29th at the Silver Spring Black Box Theater. Tickets and information at improbablecomedy.com.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. The purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, especially when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Cat Scan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album, reflecting the time and this cultural moment, is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. Michelle Nguyen, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Thanks for having me back.
A few days ago, you wrote on Facebook a post that was quite striking, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to ask you what you're thinking. This is not the left's Tea Party. This is Democrats realizing this is not the moment for elected officials who vote their campaign platforms 50% of the time, but give a good speech to be in office. We are close to a constitutional crisis, and those 10 Senate Dems are the tip of the iceberg. Voting for cabinet members, crypto, Lincoln Riley, taking days to comment on the situation in Colombia. This isn't the blue wave of 2026 timeline, where 18 months from now, the pendulum swings back our way. The press secretary said to the judicial branch yesterday that they are deporting people for exercising their First Amendment rights, targeting liberal arts universities, and spreading measles in labor and delivery wards. No MSNBC clip, or we shall overcome, is going to save these elected officials from their base, because the base has decided politics is over. Either do the bare minimum of protecting the Constitution or get out of the way.
What we've seen the past 54 days is that the party, as it currently is, and specifically the elected officials, like, I don't even think this is a DNC infrastructure problem. The elected officials of our party are not sufficient to meet the moment we're in. And I think it's because many of them have been able to win elections while only being there with us on the basics of the Democratic platform 50% of the way. And it's why we have struggled to get things like $15 minimum wage, why we struggle to keep labor. Because you look up some of these folks' labor records, and they're not that good. But we're supposed to be the party of labor. You look up who is opposing minimum wage increases, and it's still Democrats. We struggle on so many things that are supposed to be fundamental to our party. I think the filibuster is a perfect example. When we have the Senate, we don't want to get rid of the filibuster because of decorum and wanting to put principle over power. Now we're in the minority. Why didn't we use the filibuster last week? There have been times in this country where people literally beat each other with canes out of anger and opposition in U.S. Congress. Strom Thurmond did a 24-hour filibuster in the 1950s. No one was asking for that. We were asking for the senators to vote no on a bill that, with the Republican mandate, they didn't need any of you to vote yes on anyway. And if they did, they should have came over and asked to negotiate. We had 10 people give away something for nothing when they didn't need to.
By last week, you mean the continuing resolution on which Senator Chuck Schumer capitulated to the Trump administration alongside 9 other Democratic senators. Schumer was on television all of last weekend explaining.
Because his argument is that if the government would have shut down, it would have been shut down for 9 months. They would have opened it piece by piece. They would have used the opportunity to shut down departments. They would have done this. They would have done that. While I do not want the government to shut down and I don't want people to be furloughed, they've been shutting down the government anyway. Doge is walking into offices without any congressional authority, telling people, give us your passwords and get out. This is already happening. So you're not actually preventing this from happening. You're capitulating to the other side, to which Republican leadership was like, we didn't think it would be this easy. You didn't ask for anything? You didn't, like, what did we get out of this? 10 of you voted for this continuing resolution. What did your voters get out of you voting for this? Yes, your federal voters got to keep their jobs until Doge decides to cut them.
Schumer might say that it's a difference of scale. That if all of the feds were suddenly let go, instead of smaller numbers, that difference of scale is important. Secondly, on the DC budget, the Senate passed a new bill that restored essentially the $1 billion that the U.S. House had tried to cut. Now, the House has to further act on it. And the expectation, however, now is that DC, by acquiescing to the road name change, by Schumer agreeing to this, was restored $1 billion.
It was restored with restraints, is my understanding. Like, they didn't just put back the $1 billion. They put a lot of restraints around it, a lot of regulation, a lot of supervision. When people are looking at what's happening in this country, they understand what Chuck Schumer is saying, But death by 1,000 cuts is still death. Rand Paul voted no. And I think that is getting lost in the sauce here. Fetterman made a statement, I will never vote for the government to shut down. What? You'll never vote for the government to shut down? So they can put anything in these CRs. Because this was barely a CR, right? Like a continuing resolution is just supposed to be a continuation of the budget we already have. They threw a bunch of crap in there.
Why do you think he's doing that?
Folks are not realizing the moment we're in. I mean, this is probably since Nixon, and I think even that was a little different, the most that a president has tested the Constitution. Probably since Lincoln was out here suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War. The checks and balances are now thrown off because the Republican Party in the House is like, we're with you, whatever you want to do. We don't care. The judicial branch is giving these rulings, right? Like telling them you have to turn the plane around. You can't fire people this way. These people need to be reinstated. We actually have no idea what happens if the Trump administration is like, we're not doing it and keeps doing what they're doing. And then now we're seeing a conversation about impeaching judges. The Chief Justice has had to come out and say something. We don't know what this is going to look like 3 months from now.
When the Democratic Party does things like confirm Marco Rubio 99-0 or passes the continuing resolution,
or Laken Riley, or voting for that crypto bill a couple weeks ago.
Right. So when they do that, do they legitimize the Trump administration?
Last year, this is the same party where the electeds were saying Trump is a danger to society, Trump is working with Putin, the administration, Project 2025, they're going to tear apart this, they're going to tear apart that. You are in the minority. You are supposed to, at this point, be the opposition party, be the party of resistance. Why are we voting for any of these people? If you truly believed what you were saying last year, why are you supporting any of these cabinet picks? Are you actually not realizing the moment we're in? Do you not think it's as bad as it actually is? And are you worried about keeping structure, keeping decorum? Are you worried about the presentation of our government versus if this man could, he would turn America into an authoritarian fascist society?
It seems like Democrats want to walk both those paths, right? So for example, even in Maryland, Governor Westmore apparently told the Baltimore Banner, I am not the leader of the resistance. I am the governor of Maryland, right? And therefore, that I have to act in a certain way. So act as if, things are normal. Mayor Bowser in Washington, D.C. acquiesced to removing the Black Lives Matter mural from near the White House.
No one's asking any of these people to be the leaders of the resistance. That's the thing. We're asking you to vote no on a bad bill and make the party that is in the majority work to pass it. That's it.
So why do they feel that they need to walk both this path? Everything can, the institutions are functioning on the one hand, on the other saying, no, the institutions are in collapse.
The argument that was given at the beginning when folks were voting for cabinet picks and voting for Laken Riley and voting for some of this crypto and avoiding saying anything about what Trump was saying he was going to do in Gaza or what's happening at Columbia University was that a lot of these folks are in districts and in states that Trump won. So they're trying to toe this line to make sure they can run for re-election. I don't actually think that's true because at this point, with everything that's happening in this administration, most Americans probably have the memory of a goldfish because there's 5 new things every day. So they're not going to remember whether or not you voted yes or no on a bill on January 8th, when by January 30th, there was like 50 things that had already happened. And I think when we're looking at the overall history of the party, I think a lot of our party's values and that fundamental drive to fight for values in a very particular way died in 1968. And I don't know if we ever got it back. I just rewatched the LBJ PBS documentary, and I'm in the process of rewatching the Roosevelt's documentary. Ken Burns, absolutely great. And That's just not how the party is anymore. We have a lot of folks who are with us, again, like 50% of the time. We live in a blue state. I know a bunch of folks who live in blue states. It's expensive. It's getting more expensive. And there are articles all the time about people on the West Coast who are living in Washington or Oregon making 70 or 80K a year, and they have to live in their car. People are frustrated because they see a party. These are my values. My values are, we need to raise the minimum wage. I want people to be able to earn a living. I want people to be able to better themselves. And I think that the government should be able to support people who want to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make a better life for themselves and their family. And they're looking at their party and they're like, I don't know if you are living up to what I think our party is supposed to be. And I also don't think you are meeting the moment of where our country is in. And therefore, I don't know what this is anymore. Because it's not like people didn't used to be friends with Republicans, right? Like Democrats and Republicans used to be buddy-buddy all the time. Their kids played soccer together because at one point, all these people basically lived in DC and went to their districts every now and then. It's not like people haven't taken money before, right? Like if anything, back in the day, people used to take money under the table all the time and they'd still vote the way we needed them to vote. I don't think there wasn't lobbying and people taking money from businesses during the civil rights movement.
So what changed?
I don't know what has happened with our elected officials that they have found themselves in a moment where they can't live what is supposed to be the party values and stay in office. I do think that in 1968, we hit a moment where the party didn't know how to message anymore.
Explain that.
In the 60s, you could say the party, within the party infrastructure, not including like the civil rights movement and the activist infrastructure, the party had three main figures: JFK, RFK, LBJ. JFK had been assassinated. LBJ, who probably would have been next to FDR as one of the greatest presidents of the 20th century, Vietnam put him in a position where he did not think he could run for re-election. So he decides not to run. And then RFK probably was the only person who could speak to the great things that Kennedy and LBJ did in a way that felt authentic while still admonishing the Vietnam War, is assassinated. And then in the same year, you also have MLK assassinated. Then you have Nixon, who is talking about the silent majority, and there are all these people who don't want this, who don't want the protests, who don't want the civil rights movements moving too fast, who we've lost focus on everyday Americans. And I think the party was unable to find a way to message the Great Society and the great things that had happened. And we've never been able to get back to that.
If there is continuity from 68 to this point now, what explains Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Obama?
If we look at Bill Clinton, the things that he talked about in his platform are very different from what the LBJ, Kennedy, RFK era talked about. Right to work for welfare, I don't think that was something they talked about during the Great Society. Most labor people would say that NAFTA was part of the death of the labor movement for a while in the US. In the 60s, labor and the party were like this. And I don't know if that would have happened. Clinton was meeting the moment of where especially Southern Democrats were, because the party lost a lot of those Southern Democrats in the 60s.
Are you basically talking about race at this point?
I don't think it's only race as in like KKK. Even if we're looking at the 1980s and we're talking about how Reagan talked about the crack era or welfare queens, there was also this idea, which Americans still have, that poor Black and brown people are sucking up all of the government resources for free.
How did Clinton answer that?
He said, no, if you want to be on welfare, you need to work.
So Clinton basically triangulates us famously. And so he brings the Democratic Party more towards the center, closer to answering the Reagan complaints.
Saying a yes and, like almost saying like, yes, this was happening. And now we're going to make sure that doesn't happen anymore by making people work. Yeah.
In your framework, how do you fit Obama?
Similar to Jimmy Carter being a response to Nixon, I think we're in a 2008 financial crisis. Hope, change. People want those things. I think President Obama was a great president. I also think it would be disingenuous for anyone to say that President Obama was a super liberal, progressive president.
But he also won 2012.
He did. He also won 2012 because he turned things around. Clinton also won re-election.
You established this continuity from 1968 through Obama, but the argument you initially made was that the Democrats have not recovered from losing their message at that time. But it seems that both Clinton and Obama, maybe less so Jimmy Carter, succeeded in their messaging such that they could win majority.
Their messaging, not the messaging. Up until 1968, Democrats had a message from the New Deal to 1968. That government is here to help and uplift people, to take people out of poverty, to help people go to college, to make their life better. That messaging, they felt after 1968 no longer worked, which is not true. Vietnam overshadowed all of those things. That wasn't the message that Clinton brought in 1992. And I don't think that was necessarily the message that Obama brought in 2008. I also think if we look at the Affordable Care Act, I think we agree that that's probably the biggest piece of legislation comparable to the Great Society and the New Deal. Then we look at what happened to get us to where we are now. We saw Democrats kind of step away. The rollout wasn't perfect. We didn't really see people championing the great legislative achievement that this was. We kept losing and losing. We lost the presidency. We get it back. A pandemic was probably a large portion of that. And then we lose it again. I think that goes to that same narrative of we have this amazing thing that we did. And because of all of these other things surrounding it, we don't feel comfortable championing the work that it was. Look at our 2010 and 2014 elections. One, Obama may have won. We lost a lot of seats in the House and the Senate and at the state and local level. Two, that messaging wasn't what Democrats were doing. We weren't saying that healthcare, like our country is
but
too
can you
great.
Hold the Democrats' feet to the 2010 and 2014 losses? 2010 particularly seemed like a red wave.
What people say is the red wave happened in a response to a black president. I don't think it's necessarily one thing or the other. I think Democrats were not messaging their achievements in a way that reminded people that this is what Democrats do. They rebuild the economy. They bring government resources to people. That this is something that Democrats have been trying to do for 50 years.
How much of all this has to do with the coalitional nature of democratic politics? It seems to me that you're saying that in 1968, what broke down for the party was the programmatic approach that they had taken between the New Deal and Great Society. And then thereafter, they have not been able to build back the programmatic approach. And instead now, it's this big tent party with various small tents inside of it. And then, as a consequence, you get these 50% Democrats, as you just described.
Listening to LBJ talk, I don't think he was ever anti-Big Tent. I think in his mind, he's like, one, I might think this is the right thing to do. But two, if we do this thing, we're going to get these voters for the next 50 years. I think what broke down in terms of the messaging is the ability to separate something that was done under the party that didn't go well, which is what happened in the Vietnam War, and everything else that the party was doing. they weren't able to separate the two and no longer had a messenger to do it.
That conundrum is repeating itself over and over again. But faced with the conundrums, as we just said, Clinton and Obama, they resolved the problem. The question is it purely then a matter of finding the right leader who can bridge those two arguments in a reasonable, convincing way?
Well, because it didn't bleed, right? Like their House and Senate Democrats were not able to replicate that because both of them faced pretty big losses in their midterms. The inability of the party to replicate that messaging in a way that spoke to voters is because after 68, in order to keep the party alive, the big tent started to mean something different. And it started to mean that we were willing to accept folks who were only 50% of the way with us if they had a D next to their name, and they voted with us like 50% of the time. That's how you get a Senator Joe Manchin who said that West Virginia didn't need stimulus checks. His voters didn't need $2,000. It's one of the poorest states in the country. What do you mean they don't need $2,000? There was a point in time where Southern Democrats still voted with Northern Democrats because of social welfare programs. Even though they hated the quote unquote stink of the civil rights movement, they wanted the social welfare programs for their people and therefore stuck with the Democratic Party.
What is the difference between the Southern Democrats and Joe Manchin?
I don't know if it was purely Reaganomics and purely racism that the Southern Democrats were finally just like, we don't care anymore. I don't know if it was abortion. I don't know if it was guns, right? Like there have been a lot of issues over the past 25, 30 years.
The problem with some of this is that folks in West Virginia, folks in Georgia, folks in other red states have in fact voted against their economic interest. So it's not just Joe Manchin that says, I don't need the stimulus checks. In some ways, people in West Virginia are going, yes, stimulus checks, but, I'm going to vote red. How does recreating a stronger Democratic message to what it represented pre-68, how would it resolve this problem?
I also, over the weekend, watched a PBS documentary on Huey Long. I want to start this by saying Huey Long had a lot of problems. Okay. I want to start with that disclaimer.
Right.
When he was first running for office in Louisiana, the way that poor white people and poor Black people talked about this person was the exact same. Because he was talking about making their lives better. And the way that we were able in the 1960s to both uplift racial justice and the New Deal and the Great Society was because we were improving everyone's lives. So even though the Southern Democrats had to hold their nose and vote for these things, they did it because their constituents' lives were improving. And I think what we are seeing is that that's no longer happening. Yes, due to those voters and them voting against their self-interest. But it is also the case that if they look on the news in a lot of quote unquote like blue cities, people's lives aren't that great either. So I think some of that's due to how the news displays different places and what is made to look good versus bad. But they might think that the idea of what the Democratic Party's platform is better for these folks. But I also think they can point to places that are run by Democrats where people are just as poor, are just as hungry, are in just as bad schools.
We are coming into 2026. Is it your expectation that given where the Democratic Party is now, that you're going to get a lot more folks trying to primary out incumbents who are 50% Democrats?
There has been a bench on the Democratic side that has not been able to grow or move because we have folks in office who are in their 80s and 90s. We're going to have a lot of people run for office. And I do think some of these folks are going to win. I actually think one of the things that happened to the Republican Party that is the reason why they are in such lockstep with Trump was Eric Cantor losing a primary. I think that changed how a lot of these folks did what they were doing because they realized anybody can get got. The closest that the Democratic Party has come to that in recent times has been AOC.
Does that mean that you can run in a local election against Trump? I mean, is that a viable position locally to use?
I think it will be very difficult in the upcoming cycles to have a conversation or to launch a campaign and not talk about this administration.
Oh, sure.
I also think you will lose steam if you are not talking about the everyday things that are affecting your voters, many of which existed long before Trump. I think in this area, you can't not talk about it because you've got a bunch of people who are unemployed because of Doge. I don't know if it can be an entire platform unless you can relate everything that he's doing to why there are problems that you are trying to solve.
Even in deep blue Montgomery County, 30% of the population is Republican or Trump aligned at this point. And the framing of all of this, are neighborhoods safer today than they were in 2021, 22? Yes. Are there fights in schools? But there were fights in schools in 2018. And
there were fights in school when I was in school.
Exactly. We don't really have good data to say that they have grown or not. We see them more because obviously there's a smartphone effect. But those are very difficult arguments to make in the face of a strongly activist group of people. And so it becomes very difficult to do all of those things in any reasonable manner, to make reasonable arguments. What ends up happening is you either choose to run against Trump or you focus on the local stuff and you get drowned out, messaging wise. And you run against Trump and people go, you're not solving any of these problems. So given that dichotomy, what ends up happening is you are essentially trying to stitch together a coalition of groups. And you're getting these kind of leaders that are 50%.
Yeah. You can tell someone that crime is down, but if they turn on the news and crime happened down the street, even if that's the first time that crime has happened in 10 years in that neighborhood, crime is not down because crime is up. We struggle to balance principles and power. We want to focus on the data. We want to focus on the principle of the matter, which is that crime is down. We have done this thing and this thing and this thing to bring crime down. And that's what we want to talk about. When the reality of the situation is, as long as people feel that crime is happening near them, it doesn't matter if crime in their region is down. So when you talk about crime, you have to acknowledge how they feel first in order to have the conversation that you want to have about crime. And that is a power move of persuasion. And I think our party doesn't always feel comfortable not manipulating voters, but having conversations in a way that voters will find effective if it feels as though they are manipulating them.
I'm sure there's a lot you can do as a campaign consultant to get them to think about this more seriously. Michelle Nguyen, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Good luck in New York.
Thanks.
Usually, we draw lessons at this time, but Democratic political consultant Michelle Nguyen has put the conundrum of the 50% Democrat in sharp relief. So, that's all for this episode. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C., Paul Chaparas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album reflecting the time and this cultural moment is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.